Hello everybody, and welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. We're leaving behind the brainstem, the diencephalon. We're leaving behind the basal ganglia and the limbic system. We're entering the cerebrum. That is the largest part of the brain. It's cut up here, but it's made up of two cerebral hemispheres. So there's a left and a right hemisphere. Now, if you remember in the spinal cord, remember in there the gray matter was located deep or on the inside. And here in the brain, the gray matter, which is called the cerebral cortex, that is located very superficial or on the surface of the brain. So you can see here's the gray matter right there. So this would be the white matter made of myelinated axons, which is deep of the gray matter. Also remember that gyri or gyrus, those are the folds or the wrinkles in the brain. Sulci are the shallow grooves, the sulcus, that would be singular, sulci is plural. And fissures are the very, very deep grooves in the brain. And here are the two cerebral hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere. They are separated from each other. The longitudinal fissure, which basically runs directly down the middle or the median. So it would cut your brain into a mid-sagittal section. Now, hopefully remember, these two hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right, they're connected to each other. They can actually talk to each other through what is called the corpus callosum. So when that is severed, your left and right brain are basically independent. So what the right one is thinking about or doing, the left one is totally unaware of it. Each hemisphere of the brain is further divided into 4 different lobes. So of course you have right here the frontal lobe because it's in the front. It is separated from the parietal lobe, just posterior, by what's called the central sulcus. So remember, sulcus, that is a shallow groove in the brain. So the central sulcus is what divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. In the very posterior part of the brain, you have the occipital lobe, which is involved in vision. And you can't really see it here, but on the side and inferior or below the parietal lobe, you'll have what's called the temporal lobe. And the 4 lobes of the brain and basically what their functions are. These are very large areas of the brain, so obviously they have a lot of functions. So the first one is the frontal lobe. This is where your primary motor area is. So this is where all your voluntary skeletal muscle movements are initiated. That's in the frontal lobe. It's also where your personality mainly is stored. Some speech, especially speech production like talking. And also most of your memory is located in the frontal lobe. Now the parietal lobe, which is located just posterior to the frontal lobe. Remember, they were separated from each other by the central sulcus. So this is where our sensory, so in the frontal lobe we had the primary motor area or the primary motor cortex. In the parietal lobe we have the primary somatosensory cortex, which is basically what allows the part of your brain which is responsible for receiving incoming sensory information and turning that into a particular feeling, like, hey, I feel pressure, or hey, I feel somebody is touching me. So this is the part of the brain which receives the sensory information from your peripheral nervous system and translates that into some sort of feeling. Also some taste. Now you got the temporal lobe located on the side, kind of where your temple is. Hearing, taste, smell, and some speech and language in the temporal lobe. And easiest one for sure is the occipital lobe, located in the posterior region of the brain, of the cerebrum, and that is what is involved in vision. And once again, some views of the lobes of the brain. So yes, here's the frontal lobe up here in the front, separated from the parietal lobe by right here, which is the central sulcus. Just behind that or posterior to that, you have the parietal lobe. Remember, the left and right brain hemispheres are separated by the longitudinal fissure, which basically cuts the brain into a left and right halves or hemispheres. Down here you can see the temporal lobe, which is on the side of your brain where your temple's at. And in the back you can see right here the occipital lobe where the primary visual cortex is located. And down here you have the cerebellum. Now, you're definitely going to be able to have to label a brain and label where the different lobes are. And I would definitely remember the central sulcus, the division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And remember, this postcentral gyrus, where the primary somatosensory cortex is located, and the precentral gyrus, right here, this is where the primary motor cortex is located. So this is what creates voluntary skeletal movements, and this is what receives sensory information from your peripheral nervous system so you can feel various sensations. That is going to be, and basically what I went over on the last slide. So the lobes are separated by sulci and fissures. So remember the central sulcus, definitely know that one. So if the central sulcus is right here, can't get it to write. Why isn't it writing? There we go, right there. That's the central sulcus. This would be the precentral gyrus would be just anterior to that. And the postcentral gyrus, where the somatosensory cortex is, would be located just posterior to the central sulcus. So that's basically what these things are saying right here. Where's the precentral gyrus? Motor cortex. Where's the postcentral gyrus? Somatosensory cortex. Three broad classes of functional areas of the cerebral cortex. First are the sensory areas. So these are the areas of the brain which are in charge of receiving sensory input from your peripheral nervous system, and then it analyzes it, it interprets what those action potentials, what those nerve impulses actually are. Is it painful? Does it feel good? Where in my body is this stimuli coming from? So those are the sensory areas of the brain. Then you have the motor areas of the brain. Remember the primary motor cortex located in the frontal lobe. That's what's going to control your skeletal or voluntary movement. And then you have all those other neurons in the brain, which are the association areas of the cerebral cortex. And this is where your memory is stored, your emotions, your personality, your intelligence. So it's basically everything that makes you who you are. That would be the association areas of the cerebral cortex. And these things are located all over the place. There's association areas in all lobes of the brain. And I think it's a good time for a brain break. Now remember, don't spend an hour trying to think of this, because no matter what you put, we always make your answer correct. So you don't really have to get it, but if you like, riddles are fun. Feel free to take a few minutes. All right, so what has a head, a tail, is brown, and has no legs? What has a head, a tail, is brown, and has no legs? See if you can get it. And the answer, of course, is a penny. And some different areas of the cerebral cortex. So we've gone over this one quite a few times. The primary somatosensory cortex or somatosensory area right here on the postcentral gyrus. Remember, a gyrus is a bump, and it's called a bump in the surface of the brain, and it's called the postcentral gyrus because it's located just behind or posterior to the central sulcus, which is right there. Remember, okay, so here we have the primary visual area. Since it's visual, of course, it's going to be in the occipital lobe. And the primary visual area is located right there. We also have Wernicke's area here, which is located on the temporal lobe. And that is what allows you to understand or comprehend speech. So if someone's talking to you, it is this area of the brain which allows you to comprehend speech. Then which goes with that is Broca's area, which is right here in the frontal cortex. And it's right there in the primary motor cortex. So that's what allows you to produce, or basically to talk, to produce speech. That is Broca's area. Now, let's see if anybody can tell me what is wrong with this slide. If this is Broca's area and this is Wernicke's area, well, what's wrong with this picture? See if you can figure it out. And hopefully you guys said that since this is the posterior of the brain, this is the anterior, the frontal lobe, this would be the right hemisphere of the brain. And we know that speech in almost all people is located in the left hemisphere of the brain. So Broca's and Wernicke's area would actually be on the other side of the brain, but you kind of get the idea. So there's Broca's area right there. You got the primary auditory area, or the primary auditory cortex. That's going to be located in the temporal lobe right there. But basically, if you just know it's located in the temporal lobe, that's usually pretty good. You have the primary gustatory area, or gustatory cortex. This is the area of the brain which is involved in taste. And I've written too much on there, but you can see it's number 43. And 43 is hidden right in there. So it's a part of the parietal lobe. And it's at the very inferior part of the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's the part of the brain that allows you to taste things like sweet, salty, sour, bitter, etc. And two motor areas of the cerebral cortex, remember, this is the central sulcus, that shallow groove that separates the brain into the anterior and posterior part, or separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. And just anterior to that, or in front of that, you have the precentral gyrus, and that's where we have our primary motor cortex. So that's what initiates motor movement. So down here, it's relegated to the face. So let's use a different color. So down here, and we're going to show what all these little different areas are. So basically, if you hooked up an electrode to different areas of this motor cortex, it would make different parts of your body move, depending on where the brain is being stimulated in the motor cortex. And down here, just inferior at the very bottom, that's where you have Broca's area. So that is for speech production. That is what allows you to talk. And that would be Broca's area, number 44. And this whole right here is the primary motor cortex, number 4. And here's some association areas of the cerebral cortex. So these are like areas that kind of help. So remember, this is the primary motor cortex right here. Well, there's also an area just anterior to that called the premotor cortex. So these are association areas which are kind of helpers for the primary areas of the brain. So yeah, so I just said the premotor area is not the primary motor cortex, but it does store things like skilled movements like typing, and it also, information goes back and forth between the primary motor cortex and the premotor area. They kind of work together to produce your voluntary skeletal movements. Also the somatosensory area, which we've gone over already. So 5 and 7. So these would be areas that assist or supplement the primary somatosensory cortex. The gnostic area, these are not going to be that important, so I'm going over them real quick. These kind of integrate all your senses. Basically, if you're doing some sort of activity, I don't know, if you're singing or dancing or whatever, it allows you to kind of comprehend and understand what you are doing. So it's not like just a bunch of random stimuli that you're receiving. It's the gnostic area that kind of puts it all together. And I mean, visual association area, you know that's going to be the occipital lobe. You can write these things down, but it's not going to be a major part of your exam if it's even on the exam at all. So I'll move it on. And some more special areas. We've gone over these about 3 or 4 times, so I'm going to go really, really fast. You need to label your diagram. So, hey, location, where are these structures located, and what is their function? So I'm going to do these quick. Remember, the somatosensory cortex, it's posterior to the central sulcus. It's the very anterior part of the parietal lobe. It's on what's called the post-central gyrus, because remember, a gyrus is a wrinkle or fold in the brain, and it's post-central because it's just after or behind, posterior to the central sulcus. It is on the parietal lobe, and of course its functions, sensory sensations, and you can look through all those there. Primary visual area, remember that's in the occipital lobe, which is in the very posterior part of the brain, and that's going to receive your visual stimuli. Auditory area, of course, that's located in your temporal lobe, and that's going to be hearing, sound characteristics like pitch and rhythm and so forth, basically hearing. And we've seen this picture several times, so I'm not going to go over it again, but feel free to look at that if you need to label your diagram. The primary gustatory area or primary gustatory cortex is what allows you to taste. That's its function. This one I would highly doubt you'll have to know where it's at, but it's located at the very bottom of the base of the post-central gyrus. So basically it's at the very bottom of the inferior portion of the somatosensory cortex. Primary motor area, definitely know where that's at. That's located just in front or anterior of the central sulcus on what's called the precentral gyrus. So remember, the somatosensory is on the post-central gyrus because it's behind the central sulcus, where the motor area is on the precentral gyrus, just in front of. It's in the frontal lobe, and that's what controls your voluntary muscle movements. And of course, Broca's area again, we've gone over that a few times. In most people, 97% is found in the left frontal lobe. Remember, Broca's area is responsible for speech production, producing speech, actually talking. Definitely know Broca's area because it will be on the test, but just know about where it's at. You should know it's in the frontal lobe and identify about approximately where it's at. You don't have to be exact. The somatosensory association area, you will not need to know this, I don't think. It's located just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. So just behind it, remember the somatosensory cortex is located just behind the central sulcus. So this area is located just behind the primary somatosensory area. Remember Wernicke's area, that's kind of like Broca's, but it's not speech production, it's interpreting speech. It's speech comprehension. Can you understand what somebody is telling you? Also, in most people, it's in the left hemisphere of the brain, and it's in the temporal and parietal lobes. And finally, we have our last slide, and it's on aphasia. That is a condition in which you have an inability to use or comprehend words. And there's two different types. So the first one is called non-fluent aphasia. Non-fluent. And this is when the person has damage or lesion to their Broca's speech area. So this is the type of not being able to use or comprehend words, but this is the one where you can't form words. So basically, you cannot speak. And that's non-fluent aphasia. Now the other one is fluent aphasia. That's when your Broca's area is just fine, but your Wernicke's area has been damaged. And now you have an inability to understand spoken words. So you can produce speech, you can talk, you just don't understand what they're saying when they talk back to you. And it's kind of weird, but there's actually two different types of fluent aphasia. Word deafness, where you cannot understand spoken words if you hear them, and also word blindness. These are different areas of the brain, slightly different areas of the brain. And word blindness is what you probably can figure it out. It's difficult to understand the written words. So there are two types of fluent aphasia. All right, everybody, this was a long one. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. And of course, now it's time to review. So I'm going to ask you some questions. Remember, you got to get at least 80% correct in order to receive credit. I would recommend see if you can remember it, and if you can't, then go back to your notes. But first, see if you can retrieve it from memory, and then use your notes to make sure you're correct. All right, talk to you guys next time.